Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how I painted this hedgehog in acrylics. Now once I've got the background painted in and that is fully dry, I can start working on the main subject. Now I always like to begin with the eye, and this hedgehog had quite a dark eye. There was no real iris colour, so I was just focusing on those subtle highlights on top. Now if I am working from an image that is good quality and the eye is as dark as what this is, I'm going to paint that as I see it. However, if the reference photo is lower quality, or maybe there was some red eye visible, then I will get other photos and use that as references to enhance the level of depth and realism in the eye to make my painting more realistic. Now moving on from that, I'm going to start working on the base layer. Now this is a naturally quite dark base layer because of the way that the fur has more of that coarser look to it. It's not as soft, and I want to make sure that I've captured that. Now in order to do so, one of the things here that's going to help is high contrast. Now this is something that I talk about in all of my videos, but if the fur has a little bit more of a wiry texture, then having those darker base layers in and then building up those highlights in stages is going to help to capture that. Now of course this is going to vary depending on the reference photo. Even the same hedgehog that was photographed at different times, it may look a little bit lighter from one photo to the next. But where I do have a more coarser texture, I want to be making sure that that base layer is dark enough. Now an example of this is, let's say I was painting a yellow Labrador. I'm still going to have to focus on my darker values in order to get that contrast and the shape and form correct. However, it's not going to be as dark as this base layer because the fur naturally is going to be a little bit softer. So having the variation in this base foundation and getting that accurate from each individual reference photo can make that layering process much easier. Now as I continue to use my rigger brush here, this is one of my favourite brushes for these longer but finer lines. But in order to get this brush to work as well as it currently is here, the right technique needs to be applied. Now with any brush, the more pressure we apply, the thicker that line is going to be. But with a rigger brush, it's something that's more noticeable because we're specifically trying to create very thin lines. So my first tip when using these brushes is to make sure that you only have very minimal pressure at all times on that brush. Now to create a tapered point where that natural brushstroke has a thinner tip and a thinner base, we want to use slightly less pressure at the beginning and end of that brushstroke and just fractionally more pressure in the middle. This is going to help to create more of that natural brushstroke and also make sure as well that those brushstrokes are curved. You can see here that there are no actual straight lines. Depending on the fur direction, I'm moving that brush, but each line that I paint is curved. And this is going to help add more of that shape and form to our painting. Now the fur direction is not random, it does follow the underlying bone and muscular structure. The same with the highlights and shadows. You can see from the photo of my finished painting in the corner that there is going to be a brighter highlight on the top right side of the eye where that hair begins. Now that there is indicating at the eye socket. If that highlight and that cluster of those lighter details was too high up, then I'm actually going to make it look like there is a raised eyebrow effect, and of course that is going to change the expression of the painting. So I do want to be making sure that the fur direction and the position of the highlights and shadows are accurate. This is again something that I do establish right from that base layer foundation, and I'm always reinforcing it as I build up my layers. Now one thing I want to mention about this painting is the size. This is actually really small, it's only a 4 by 6 inch. So I do need to be realistic with how much detail I can include here. But as you can see, as this painting progresses, with the right technique and the right layering approach, there is a lot of detail that we can fit in on these smaller sizes. Now these smaller paintings are perfect for overcoming that feeling of being burnt out. Now something else that is really useful for this is if we're looking to improve a specific technique, such as blending acrylics or using a rigger brush, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, then being able to really refine that technique within a couple of hours is also motivational. Now if I was to do this painting on a much larger size, I'm going to have to allocate a significantly longer period of time to get to the same end. But being able to improve that painting skills in a shorter period of time, especially when you're newer to a medium, is really useful. it can make that entire process, that specific technique, feel less daunting. So there are so many reasons why I feel these smaller paintings should be part of our painting schedule. Now, one aspect of the painting process that I cover thoroughly in all of my real-time tutorials is knowing what layer to paint first. So here I'm just blocking this in with more of this darker Mars black mixture and making sure here that I've got that base foundation as dark as it needs to be, going back to the importance of contrast that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. Now, being able to work on the right layer at the right time does help to simplify a complex part of the reference photo. So because this leg is further away, it's also got a bit more of that blurrier out of focus look. I needed to get this done first before I could come back and work on the hair below the neck and on the base of the ear. If I'd have painted that hair first and then tried to blend the leg, then obviously that leg is going to be in front of that hair, it's going to bring it closer to the camera, and the perspective is going to be affected. So I want to be making sure that where possible, I'm always working with what is further away first and building up from there. Now, when working with this layering approach, it can make us feel like we've actually created mistakes midway through. So I was really happy with the level of detail that I had established on the face, and now that I've painted all of this dark section in, it sort of maybe looks like I've ruined it. However, the wonderful thing about a painting like this, especially with acrylics, is we can continue to layer as much as we need until we get to the end result. So if we create something that we don't like, it just simply means that it's not finished. We haven't ruined anything, it just means we need to keep on adding more layers. Now, as I'm working back with my rigger brush here, you can see that I'm extending the length of my brush strokes significantly compared to the face. Now, having this variation in is going to help with the level of realism that is captured. If all of my brush strokes were the same, then the painting is going to look very flat. Now, although I've used the same set of brushes, the same rigger brush for those details, I've made sure to adjust how I'm holding or moving that brush, how the paint is loaded on the brush, for example, in order to give me a slightly different effect. Now, one big tip when you are using a rigger brush for these kinds of fine lines is we want to be making sure that we've got the mixture of the paint right. Too much paint and the line is going to have a bit more of that broken up effect where it's not able to flow off the brush properly. If there's too much water, then you're going to end up potentially with that brush stroke almost looking like it has a bit of a beaded up effect at the beginning and the end of the brush stroke. So these two factors here are really important in getting that consistency of the paint correct when using a rigger brush. Now, when I started working on the spines, I knew that this is going to be one area that could get confusing very quickly. So I decided to split this up into more whole individual layers and more separate processes. So my first priority was to just establish with a mid-tone, something that's not too bright, is the direction of those spines. Once I had that in and it was fully dry, I can then come back in with a glaze to adjust the colour. Now, this is the layering process that I'm going to rinse and repeat for this entire section. You'll see that when I'm now adding my highlights here, I will then come back in with a glaze to adjust the colour, and I will carry on doing this until I've got the right level of depth. Now, the reason I like to work in this layering process with the use of glazes, and this is in all of my paintings, is because we don't have to then worry about mixing the exact colour when focusing on adding the detail. We can split this up into two separate processes and make that painting far, far easier to tackle. Now, at this stage in the painting, it looks like spines. I've got that texture in place, but I wanted to continue to layer to enhance that level of realism. So by working with this slightly darker glaze, it doesn't look like it's doing much, but it is just toning down those highlights slightly and helping to push those down closer towards the skin, ready for the next layer of highlights. Now, when I add my highlights here for this layer, you can see that I'm also creating new sections of spines. So it might be that I need to adjust the way that they're clustered together, or I need to add a little bit more variation in the way that they are directing. But it is important to make sure that we've got enough. Now, one thing that can happen with any medium of any size is that we call a painting finished too soon. So this here, it does look like a hedgehog. The spines are different from the hair on the face. I've got that variety. But being able to continue to layer and push that even more is going to help enhance that level of realism. Now, something else that's also a possibility is we may have made a mistake, or we feel like we've added a layer that we don't like. There may be a section of the painting that doesn't match the same level of realism, and therefore we may want to come back in and make alterations. Now, I actually experienced that on the left corner, this left side of the spines, and you'll see that in the next minute or so, I'm actually going to come back in and paint over it. Now, when I know I'm going to have to make more of these drastic changes, I will always have a break from the painting. So what I decided to do is leave it overnight and then come back to it the following day so that my eyes were completely rested. Now, when I am going to then sit down on another painting session and make these changes, what I like to do is have a little bit more of a goal in mind so that I don't continue to just make the same mistakes over and over again on the previous session. So what I wanted to do for the left side of the spines, my aim was to have more of a overlapping and clustered effect so that it was more similar to the spines above the eye. Now I'm going to use the same sort of layering process, but I'm going to make sure now that I'm paying more attention to the individual spines in each of those areas. So because I've had some difficulty here, I've then come back in a moment, and I'm going to just focus on even smaller sections. Rather than doing just a little bit on the left of the ear and then the corner, I'm going to maybe break this up 1 centimetre at a time. Now, one thing here, that sounds like it's a little bit over the top, and maybe that it's going to then take hours and hours longer. But these alterations and coming back in was actually quicker than the time spent on it initially. And that's because I was making sure I had a clear plan in mind first so that I had less of that hesitation in between. Now I'm using the same sets of brushes, that small round brush. I'm then using another brush at times to blend those edges, get a little bit more of a softness. But you can see here, look at how they're more curved. I've got a little bit more of them grouped together. It's already starting to look a little bit fuller and less, I guess, unfinished compared to how it was previously. Now, when painting these spines, the shading of the base I found actually made a big difference. So the way that these spines came out from the deeper sections closer to the skin would naturally cause a shadow. So what I wanted to avoid was a harsh start point at the beginning of that brushstroke, and that then it was pointy at the end. Now, in order to capture that, you can do two methods, and I did use both of those in this painting. You can actually use a slightly darker glaze to tint the very base of those spines, making sure that the spines are dry before you do that. Or you can use that damp brush and actually blend that paint into the darker base layer. Both of those are going to give you the same end result, but I did find actually merging the two and incorporating the two together gave me the best of both worlds. Now the spines here, just at the side of the ear, I much prefer those to how they were previously. And I knew now that this was going to be very worthwhile, and I wanted to make sure then that the rest of this painting matched that same standard. So when I'm working on something that is complex and overwhelming like this, you can see how working in smaller sections has been so useful. Now, if you are an artist who does like to work in whole individual layers, that of course is absolutely fine. It's very unique to each artist. But if you do start to feel overwhelmed, or you are making the same mistakes over and over again, breaking that up into smaller sections can really help. Now, natural variety in the fur direction is something that I've already mentioned, but here you can see that I've got a couple of spines that are completely different. I really did feel that on this smaller painting, because I wasn't able to add in all of the spines that I could see in the photo, that having more of this exaggerated directional change helped with that level of realism. Now, when working on smaller paintings, we can't add in all of those directional changes. We need to just pick the main few and then work on that from there. So being able to add all of them in, we're then going to end up probably covering up too much of the base layer. So being able to get that balance just right is going to make a big difference. Now, the other thing that I started to adjust here is the length of the spines. So up above the ear and closer towards the eye, there were spines that were significantly longer. And again, this will help with the perspective of the painting. If the spines are all the same length from one area to the next, then that is also going to help make it look flat, which obviously we want to avoid when we're aiming for realism. So the length and the thickness of the spines is something that we need to be paying very close attention to. The same when we're drawing fur, feathers, or grass, any texture where we do want to have that natural variety. However, with all of that in mind, it is important to make sure that we still allow lots of the darker base layer to show through. Now, if we get carried away and add too many spines, this is actually going to look more like clustered, clumped sections of fur, which is the completely different texture to what we're trying to create. So another example of where less is more, just because we add more detail doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to look more realistic. It may be that having more of the base layers, less detail, is actually going to be more fitting for that specific texture. Now also as well, because the spines are rigid, they are a firm structure. It's not like the movement that you can get from longer hair. We have to make sure that the edges of those spines still have more of that harshness to it. It's got specific edges, whereas the hair is more soft. So making sure that we are adjusting the brush technique and how that paint is applied is definitely going to help with that level of realism. Now this is a really good base. I was happy with this now. I've got more of that softer, darker blend at the base of the spines, which I do think really helped. I now needed to add more of the spines that were overlapping on top. Now, although I am going to be covering up some of the spines, they are still showing through in between little gaps of the spines that I'm now adding. So when we're working with this level of realism, it's okay to have that feeling of, oh, do I really want to put that layer over the top because I'm going to hide some of that work that I've put in. But actually, although it might be hidden to some degree, it is still visible, and that's what's going to help with the level of depth. Now the same process is being applied here. I'm waiting for that paint to dry and then adjusting the colour with a glaze. This works really well. I can break this up into as many of those individual processes to simplify that as much as needed. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to paint along to the real-time tutorial of this hedgehog or any of my other step-by-step lessons, then I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. If you do have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.